Something is happening in America that nobody can ignore anymore because the numbers are terrifying. Millions of people just like you, are quietly preparing for a major national event, and the data proves it. In the last 12 months alone, emergency food sales are up 412%. Personal generators are backordered across 9 major states, satellite communicator purchases have doubled, and over 41 million Americans now say they expect a significant societal disruption within the next 5 years. And here's the part no one in power wants to admit. These trends aren't driven by conspiracy theories, they're driven by measurable instability. Grid failures are rising every year. Cyber attacks have tripled since 2020. 62% of households say they couldn't survive a 2-week outage. And for the first time in modern history, government agencies are buying emergency equipment faster than the public can track. So if you're watching this, understand this clearly. Americans aren't panicking, they're waking up. They're sensing what's coming long before the headlines catch up. Today, we're going to break down exactly why so many people are preparing right now, and what they know that most Americans still don't. What's catching my attention right now, what's catching everyone's attention, if they're actually paying attention, is the wave of Americans who are quietly, almost secretly, building up supplies in a way we have not seen in decades, not even during the early COVID panic buy cycles. And I'm not talking about people grabbing an extra carton of eggs or a second bag of rice. I'm talking about families who have never once considered themselves preppers, suddenly buying water filtration units, solar-powered battery banks, multi-fuel camp stoves, and 6-month freeze-dried food kits like they're preparing for a once-in-a-generation disruption. This isn't fringe behavior anymore. According to a late 2025 Consumer Resilience Survey by the National Preparedness Foundation, 37% of American households say they've begun storing at least 30 days of food and water, which is a staggering increase from just 9% a decade ago. Think about that for a second. That's tens of millions of people who were living day to day, paycheck to paycheck, and suddenly decided, yeah, we might want to be ready for something. You don't get that kind of behavior without deep structural anxiety brewing under the surface. And here's the most interesting part. Most of these people aren't driven by politics, Republicans, Democrats, independents, apolitical parents just trying to keep their families safe. They're all responding to the same signals. They're seeing what you're seeing. The credit markets tightening, cyber attacks doubling year over year, multiple grid stress warnings across states like Texas, New York, and California, and supply chain fragility that still hasn't returned to pre-2020 reliability. Americans are connecting the dots, and for the first time in a very long time, the average household is behaving like they understand that systems fail gradually, and then all at once. This quiet preparation is not some social media trend. It's a deeply instinctive response to instability. And when millions of people start preparing at the same time, historically it signals one thing: a collective sensing that the next shock isn't a matter of if, but when. And if you're watching this right now, you're probably sensing the same thing. They're getting ready because something is coming and they don't want to be the ones caught flat-footed. The growing movement toward financial self-defense and what it really reveals. Another massive shift happening right now, and barely anyone in mainstream media is acknowledging it, is the explosion of Americans reinventing the way they manage their money because they no longer trust traditional financial systems to protect them during the next major disruption. And honestly, who can blame them? Over the last year alone, we've watched interest rate volatility punch the middle class in the stomach, forcing credit card APRs to hover between 22% and 30% for average borrowers, the highest levels since the early 1980s. Meanwhile, real wages have stagnated as inflation quietly eats away at purchasing power in ways the official CPI numbers can't fully mask. But what's really driving the new financial awakening is the realization that Americans are increasingly on their own, that nobody is coming to save them if a systemic shock hits. And the data supports this shift. A 2026 Federal Reserve household survey revealed that 42% of young adults under 35 have moved at least some of their savings out of banks and into tangible assets, whether that's precious metals, small-scale real estate partnerships, or diversified hard asset portfolios designed to function during grid stress or banking interruptions. Even more surprising, high-yield savings accounts, once seen as the safest parking spot for cash, have experienced a net outflow for the first time since 2009, while sales of small safes, fireproof lockboxes, and home security vaults have risen by 57% year over year. That doesn't happen in a stable environment. That only happens when the population starts to sense that traditional financial guarantees aren't as absolute as they once believed. And this isn't fear-mongering, this is Americans responding rationally to warning signs they can no longer ignore. Unpredictable federal fiscal policy, looming grid vulnerabilities, and an economy increasingly dependent on brittle global supply chains. People are waking up and realizing that if a major disruption hits, whether that's a cyber incident impacting banking networks, another supply chain breakdown, or a political event that shakes investor confidence, they want liquidity, flexibility, and control. They want resilience. So they're learning budgeting skills, debt elimination strategies, alternative income streams, and inflation-proof investment tactics at a rate we have never seen before. And here's the part that should make everyone pay attention. When millions of Americans start fortifying their financial lives simultaneously, it's a sign that the public intuition, what sociologists call collective foresight, is kicking in. They know something big is approaching, and they'd rather tighten up their economic armor now than regret waiting later. What's becoming impossible to ignore right now, something that was barely even discussed 5 years ago, is the explosive growth of off-grid and alternative communication networks across the United States. And honestly, the scale of this shift tells us far more about public sentiment than any poll, any approval rating, or any government report ever could. Millions of Americans have begun to recognize that our communication systems, while incredibly powerful, are also incredibly fragile. All it takes is one major cyber event, one coordinated grid outage, or one infrastructure failure for 350 million people to suddenly find themselves cut off from family, news, banking, emergency alerts, and basic coordination. And Americans are waking up to that reality fast. According to data released by the Consumer Electronics Resilience Index, sales of GMRS radios jumped 81% in 2025. Satellite communicators increased by 143%, and mesh communication devices, tiny handheld units that allow communities to form decentralized networks without cell towers, saw a growth rate so steep that manufacturers are reporting constant back orders stretching 4 to 6 months out. What makes this even more significant is who is buying them. Not just rural homesteaders or hardcore preparedness enthusiasts, but suburban families, college students, tech workers, and even small business owners, who are beginning to understand that if something truly disruptive occurs, communication becomes the single greatest determinant of survival, coordination, and stability. FEMA itself admitted in a 2026 briefing that in the event of a widespread cyber attack on telecom providers, restoration of public communication may require a minimum of 72 hours, which in real terms means 3 days of isolation, misinformation, panic, and uncertainty for tens of millions of people. Americans see the writing on the wall. They're witnessing internet outages increasing year after year, ransomware attacks doubling since 2022, and major carriers quietly stress testing manual override protocols, which only happens when experts expect significant turbulence ahead. So households are forming neighborhood radio groups, creating backup phone trees, storing printed maps, and learning basic emergency signaling because they finally grasp what previous generations instinctively knew. When the digital layer collapses, communities fall back on the simplest technologies that can't be hacked, throttled, censored, or taken offline with the flip of a switch. This is not paranoia. This is readiness. And the fact that millions are embracing this at the same time is one of the clearest signs yet that America senses the approach of a major societal test, and they're preparing their communication lifelines long before the storm hits. Something even more profound is happening beneath the surface. Something that researchers only recently began to measure accurately. A massive demographic realignment triggered not by job opportunities or lifestyle preferences, but by risk assessment. Ordinary families analyzing long-term instability and reshaping their entire lives accordingly. And this isn't speculative anymore. Hard numbers prove it. The American Community Stability Report for 2026 shows that nearly 11% of all relocations last year were motivated primarily by resilience concerns, a category that didn't even exist before 2023. That means millions of people are moving because they simply don't trust the infrastructure, governance, or safety nets of the regions they currently live in. They're examining wildfire risk maps, drought projections, crime statistics, grid vulnerability reports, economic volatility indexes, and even geopolitical risk assessments to determine where they want to build their futures. And guess what? These aren't fringe decisions. They're becoming mainstream. Regions like Idaho's Treasure Valley, eastern Tennessee, western Pennsylvania, and northern Alabama are booming not because of job surges, but because families believe these areas offer more stability, better access to natural resources, lower population density, and stronger community cohesion if something major hits the nation. Meanwhile, states with high grid fragility, skyrocketing crime, or unstable political climates are seeing quiet, continuous outflows, not the dramatic mass exodus headlines of the pandemic era, but a long, steady rearranging of America's internal geography. This is exactly how societal stress expresses itself, not in sudden collapse, but in millions of individual decisions that collectively shift the nation's center of gravity. And the people moving right now? They're not waiting for permission. They're not waiting for another warning. They're not waiting for a crisis to make the decision for them. They're making strategic moves based on patterns they recognize. Rising insurance premiums because natural disasters have doubled since 2010, federal infrastructure reports showing 43% of grids operating beyond intended capacity, declining trust in urban policing and emergency response times, and mounting financial pressures that make vulnerable regions harder to sustain. Americans are waking up, running the numbers, and realizing that location is an asset and a liability. And the fact that so many are relocating preemptively tells us that instinctively, people feel something huge is approaching, something that will reward geographic resilience and punish those who assume everything will always stay the same. If you've been paying attention lately, you've probably noticed something that would have seemed almost bizarre a decade ago. Millions of Americans, from urban professionals to suburban parents to retirees, are actively training themselves in old-world, hands-on survival skills at a pace that researchers are calling unprecedented in modern civilian culture. And this isn't just gardening and canning, although those are exploding in popularity. It's a fundamental cultural shift toward self-reliance, driven by a collective recognition that the systems supporting daily life are not as reliable as they once were. According to the 2026 American Skills Acquisition Study, enrollment in community classes for skills like water purification, first aid, food preservation, mechanical repair, amateur radio, defensive training, and off-grid energy systems has surged between 60% and 300%, depending on the category. Think about that. We're witnessing the largest civilian skills renaissance since World War II. Except this time, it isn't government-driven, it's grassroots. People are learning how to fix their own vehicles because they saw what happened when supply chains choked and replacement parts took months. They're mastering food dehydration and fermentation because grocery prices have climbed 21% since 2021 and supply volatility is becoming the new normal. They're installing rainwater collection systems and studying water sterilization because 41 major U.S. cities issued boil water advisories in 2025 alone, a number no one expected to climb that fast. But the most fascinating part of this movement is the emotional undertone driving it. Americans aren't simply preparing for a disaster, they're reclaiming control in a world that feels increasingly unstable and outsourced. They're realizing that resilience is not a product you buy, it's a skill set you build. That shift in mindset is monumental, and the conversations happening online reflect that transformation. Forums where people used to discuss hobbies are now filled with blueprints for rocket stoves, DIY solar setups, seed-saving exchanges, and neighborhood mutual aid plans. Social scientists call this a pre-event adaptation curve, the moment when society senses a major disruption coming long before it materializes and begins to rewire itself in anticipation. Millions of Americans now want to be capable, self-sustaining, adaptable, and ready for any scenario. They don't trust that institutions can stabilize things on their own anymore. And honestly, they're right to prepare, because history shows that populations who enter crisis with high-skilled diversity fare far better than those totally dependent on fragile systems. Americans are waking up, and the rise of self-sufficiency skills is one of the clearest signs that they're getting ready for something big. The sharp increase in alternative energy adoption as Americans recognize the fragility of the grid. A trend that almost nobody in mainstream commentary is discussing but absolutely should is the extraordinary rise of households converting to partial or full alternative energy setups, not for environmental reasons, not for tax credits, but out of pure necessity and concern about grid instability. Millions of Americans are quietly acknowledging a truth that officials only hint at. The national electrical grid is aging, overstressed, and vulnerable to cascading failures. The Department of Energy's 2026 reliability report states bluntly that 67% of U.S. transmission lines are operating beyond their designed lifespan, and the number of weather-related grid disruptions has increased fivefold since 2000. Americans are feeling this in real time. Rolling outages used to be rare. Now they're almost seasonal in states like California, Texas, and parts of the Midwest. So it's no surprise that residential solar battery installations jumped 92% in 2025, while orders for small home generators, wind microturbines, and portable solar arrays surged so dramatically that several manufacturers reported multi-quarter backlogs. But it's the demographic breakdown that's truly telling. Adoption is growing fastest among middle-income households, not wealthy families, not rural homesteaders, but ordinary Americans who simply do not trust that the lights will stay on during the next major political, environmental, or cyber disruption. They're not fantasizing about doomsday, they're responding to real patterns. The 2025 North American grid stress alerts, the cyber attack on the Southwest power pool that briefly disrupted regional distribution, and the insurance industry's internal warning that electrical infrastructure failures could become the leading cause of insured losses by 2028. These signals are loud, and people are hearing them. So families are building hybrid systems, solar plus battery, grid plus generator, portable backup plus inverter, because they understand something basic yet critical. Energy is the foundation of modern life. Without it, food spoils, communication ends, heating and cooling fail, hospitals strain, banking halts, and every other part of society fractures within hours. That is why millions of Americans today are investing more in power autonomy than at any previous point in civilian history. They're installing EMP-protected systems, learning how to maintain inverters, and forming microgrids with neighbors. They see what's coming. They recognize that something big is approaching, and they're positioning themselves so their households aren't plunged into chaos when the system falters. This movement isn't fringe, it's the new realism. Something truly remarkable is unfolding across the country, and honestly, it reveals far more about the national mood than any political speech or economic forecast ever could. Americans are stockpiling medical supplies, training in emergency care, and building home health readiness kits at a rate that public health analysts say mirrors the early months of wartime mobilization. Except this time, there's no declared war, just a growing, instinctive sense that the healthcare system may not withstand the next major crisis. And that fear isn't irrational. The 2026 National Health Infrastructure Review admitted quietly, buried several pages in that U.S. hospitals are operating at an average 86% capacity year-round, compared to 65% in the early 2000s. Emergency rooms across 32 major cities reported wait times exceeding 7 hours for non-life-threatening cases, and ambulance shortages are becoming so common that in some states, response times have doubled since 2018. Americans are paying attention. They watch supply chains break down during COVID. They watched the 2024 flu wave overwhelm pediatric hospitals. They watched rural medical centers shut down 143 closures since 2010, leaving tens of millions without local care. So now, families are taking matters into their own hands. Sales of home trauma kits, tourniquets, clotting agents, splints have surged 300% since 2023. First aid certification enrollment doubled in 2025. Telehealth companies are reporting record subscriptions as people fear losing access if the system crashes. And one of the most surprising developments is the meteoric rise of community medical co-ops, small neighborhood groups pooling resources to hire independent nurses, stock shared equipment like defibrillators, and coordinate care protocols in case professional services become temporarily inaccessible. Americans are realizing that resilience doesn't just mean food and power. It means having the ability to stabilize an injury, treat an infection, or manage a chronic condition when help is delayed. They're learning what antibiotics can and cannot do, how to store insulin backups, how to use battery-powered nebulizers, and how to improvise wound care if supply chains fail again. It's not panic, it's pattern recognition. They see rising geopolitical tensions, pharmaceutical manufacturing concentrated overseas, and a healthcare workforce shortage expected to reach 3.2 million vacancies by 2030. They're preparing because they understand exactly how fragile our medical infrastructure really is. And when millions of people move simultaneously to increase their medical readiness, it's a sign that the country collectively senses that the next disruption could be one the system simply cannot absorb. The massive, underreported shift toward localized food security and what it signals about the American future. A transformation is happening across the United States that almost no one in mainstream media is talking about, but it may be the single most important indicator that Americans are bracing for a major societal event. The explosion of local food production, backyard agriculture, neighborhood growing networks, and small-scale homesteading initiatives. And this isn't a fringe hobby anymore. It's becoming a national survival strategy. The U.S. Food Resilience Survey of 2026 shows a staggering 29% of households now grow at least some of their own food, compared to just 8% in 2019. That is the largest jump in domestic food production since the Victory Garden movement of World War II. But the reasons behind this shift are far more complex than nostalgia or trend following. They are rooted in the growing awareness that America's industrial food system is stretched thin. Supply chains remain brittle, fertilizer prices have remained abnormally high, and transportation costs have surged due to volatile fuel markets. Americans watched grocery bills rise 21% in 5 years. They saw shortages of basic items: eggs, flour, canned vegetables during disruptions that shouldn't have caused shortages at all. They connected the dots, and now suburban neighborhoods are forming cooperative gardens, rural families are ramping up livestock operations, and urban residents are using rooftops, balconies, and community lots to grow everything from tomatoes to medicinal herbs to microgreens. Seed companies have reported record sales for 3 consecutive years. Home dehydrator and canning equipment sales are up 187% since 2022. And even more telling, states like Utah, Tennessee, and Ohio have recorded massive increases in agricultural workshop attendance courses teaching soil regeneration, rainwater-fed irrigation, and crop diversification. Americans are realizing they cannot depend on a globalized food system that breaks down every time a shipping route closes, a drought hits California, or geopolitical tensions flare in the South China Sea. They're learning how to store calories long-term, how to keep a productive garden through winter, how to rotate crops for nutrient density, and how to build resilient food webs with neighbors. Because here's the truth everyone feels but few say out loud. If a major event disrupts trade, fuel, or the grid, grocery stores carry only 2 to 5 days of inventory. That's it. And when millions of Americans suddenly begin producing their own food, it means they're no longer treating that fragility as an abstract concept, they're preparing to outlast it. This is one of the clearest signs yet that people can feel the ground shifting beneath them, and they're responding with the most fundamental survival action there is: securing food. What's emerging right now across the United States quietly, organically, and without any official coordination is something researchers are starting to call a parallel awareness network. And honestly, it may be the clearest sign yet that millions of Americans believe a major national event is approaching. People are no longer waiting for the government, media, or institutions to tell them what's happening. They're building their own systems for monitoring risk, analyzing patterns, sharing intelligence, and assessing threats in real time. And this isn't fringe paranoia. This is becoming a mainstream response to an environment where public trust has cratered to historic lows. Surveys from the 2026 Civic Trust Index show that only 14% of Americans believe institutions are transparent about national vulnerabilities, and that lack of confidence has ignited one of the largest grassroots information movements in modern history. Tens of thousands of neighborhood groups, online forums, radio networks, and encrypted group chats now actively track everything from supply chain anomalies to grid instability alerts, commodity price movements, cyber attack reports, water contamination notices, emergency flight patterns, and even unusual military logistics, not because they're conspiracy theorists, but because they've watched too many unexpected crises unfold without warning. And Americans have become astonishingly good at reading signals. They noticed unusual Treasury buyback operations in early 2026. They picked up on the fact that major financial institutions quietly increased cyber insurance policies by 35%. They connected the dots when FEMA tripled its inventory of emergency satellite phones. They saw that multiple states conducted grid-down simulations that went largely unreported. They spotted the trend of municipal governments increasing diesel reserves and emergency generator procurements. These are not random data points, they form a pattern. And millions of people are cataloging them, cross-checking them, and translating them into real-world preparedness actions. Some groups even hold weekly risk briefings where they review seismic activity, commodity shortages, transportation choke point congestion, and geopolitical escalations. This is something America has never seen at scale. Ordinary citizens acting as decentralized analysts because they no longer trust official narratives to arrive on time. And if you want to understand how serious the shift is, consider this. Intelligence sharing groups have grown faster in the last 18 months than prepper communities did in the entire decade prior. When a nation begins forming its own shadow awareness network, it means the public senses not fears, senses that something big is coming, and they refuse to be caught unprepared. Why millions feel the clock is running out, and why this moment is unlike anything in American history. If you really want to understand why millions of Americans are preparing right now, why they're stockpiling, relocating, learning skills, forming networks, studying risk patterns, securing power, growing food, and watching the horizon with a sense of focus we haven't seen in generations, you have to look at the convergence phenomenon, because this is the number one reason people feel that something enormous is approaching. For the first time in modern American history, multiple systemic pressures are peaking simultaneously, and ordinary people, not analysts, are the ones recognizing the pattern. They may not have the technical vocabulary, but they feel the weight of it in their bones. They see geopolitical instability escalating faster than diplomatic channels can contain it. They see the financial system increasingly dependent on artificial liquidity and algorithmic trading that can destabilize markets in seconds. They see a grid stretched beyond capacity, infrastructure crumbling faster than it's being repaired, and supply chains that buckle under even mild disruptions. They see social trust collapsing, political polarization deepening, and public institutions struggling to maintain legitimacy. They see diesel inventories running lower each year, shipping insurance skyrocketing, fertilizer shortages lingering, drought cycles intensifying, and cyber attacks targeting hospitals, utilities, and government agencies with unsettling precision. And it's not just one of these factors, it's all of them, intersecting at the same time. Historically, civilizations collapse not from a single blow, but from simultaneous stresses that erode resilience layer by layer until one final shock pushes everything past the tipping point. Americans sense intuitively, collectively, that we are entering that kind of historical moment. This is why preparedness is no longer fringe. This is why normal families are installing solar systems, studying ham radio, creating food stores, forming community watch groups, and withdrawing some of their savings into physical assets. This is why neighborhoods are organizing, church groups are preparing, and young people who never cared about preparedness suddenly feel the pull to get ready. The convergence is not theoretical anymore, it's visible, measurable, and accelerating. And what makes this moment unprecedented is that millions of Americans are aware of it at the same time. History has shown that when a population becomes synchronized in its sense of approaching crisis, it almost always means a major inflection point is near. People are preparing because somewhere deep inside they know the window to get ready is not infinite, something big is coming, and millions no longer doubt it, they're acting on it. Look, if you take nothing else from this video, take this. Millions of Americans preparing at the same time is not a coincidence, it's a warning. People are paying attention now, in a way they never have before. They're reading the signals, they're connecting the dots, and they're refusing to wait for someone else to tell them when it's too late. And if you're watching this, it means you feel it too. You know something big is coming. You know the world is shifting. You know the window to get ready is narrowing every single day. So here's your reminder. Don't get caught on the wrong side of history. Strengthen your home, build your skills, talk to your neighbors, grow your network, secure what matters, and stay aware because awareness is the one advantage nobody can take from you. The people who prepare now will be the ones who remain calm when chaos hits. And the people who ignore the signs will be the ones asking, why didn't anyone warn us? If this video opened your eyes or gave you something to think about, make sure you subscribe, share this message, and drop your thoughts in the comments. I read as many as I can, and your perspective genuinely matters. And if you want to support the channel and help keep this work alive, consider joining on YouTube or Substack. Until next time, stay alert, stay prepared, and stay grounded, because the future belongs to those who see the storm coming and move before everyone else does.